All right, I want to go to introduce you, Yaron. I mean, it feels a little bit silly to introduce you to this crowd, but why don't you just give a little bit of background in case there are a few people who don't know who you are, what you do.
I was looking forward to you introducing me, not me introducing myself.
All right. Well, my co-author. Is there anything else that's important about you?
Yeah, I think that covers it, Don.
Yeah, so Yaron is the chairman of the board at ARI, ran ARI for a number of years, was CEO when I was first hired back in the day, and is, I think, by far the most widely known speaker and commenter on objectivism living today, and has a radio show, the Brook show, which is really, I mean, if you want the objectivist take on what's happened in the last 10 minutes, it's astonishing how much content you're able to produce, Yaron. But that's who you are. And tell us a little bit about sort of your journey to get to where you are today. And we can kind of keep it brief and then zoom into the pieces that people are most interested in, we think we can extract some lessons from.
Sure. So I think a lot of you know, because I've talked about it in the past, kind of my discovering Ayn Rand at age 16 through Atlas Shrugged, scrounging around for years to try to find stuff to read and be engaged in, and thinking I was the only objectivist in the world for a while. In the days before the internet, that was fairly easy, and finally discovering others who were studying Ayn Rand's ideas in Israel, being quite involved in organizing events and in organizing activities in Israel, and participating in a lot of discussion sessions, even in the 1980s, and trying to better understand the philosophy. Moved to the United States in 87. First place I came to in the US pretty much was the Thomas Jefferson School, which was the predecessor of a couple of generations ago, predecessor of Onkar. And that was 2 weeks, amazing 2 weeks. Leonard Peikoff, Harry Binswanger were among the many faculty members at the time at the conference. Got to know the people at ARI. As a consequence of that, then went to graduate school at the University of Texas, MBA and PhD in finance. Again, found a group of objectivists in Austin in the days where Austin was the backwoods, not like today where it's a center of the universe, and very active in terms of studying objectivism, discussing it, engaging both at a social and intellectual level. Started a conference business in Austin, Texas, where we'd put on conferences, the Hill Country Objectivist Societies conferences, something like that. And we would put a conference every year. It was billed as an amateurs conference because the papers were delivered primarily by non-professional intellectuals. And then in the mid-1990s, got involved with the OGC, the Objectivist Graduate Center. I also started running Lyceum International with a partner, Pamela Benson, put on objectivist conferences, landed up putting on the summer conferences that today are OCON, put those on through the 90s and other kind of conferences. And then became the CEO of the Institute in 2000. And I was a finance professor during that period of time as well. And became a CEO in 2000. In most of that period, I would say I never considered myself, and I think this is, never considered myself really an objectivist intellectual. I was studying objectivism. I was interested in objectivism. And even as a hire to the Ayn Rand Institute, I don't think I was hired as an intellectual. I was hired as a kind of a guy who could run things and get stuff done. I think the more intellectual side of the career only came about post 9/11, when there was a real demand for content, and together with Onkar, primarily with Onkar, We worked hard to develop that content, to build that content. And then I was the guy who delivered, was the primary person who delivered that content. I also discovered, in spite of terrible early experiments, discovered I was pretty good on TV and in media and in interviews and things like that. So I became kind of the guy who went on TV and did all that. And I'd say before that was really the launching event, if you will, for my intellectual career. And after that, I think most people know I ran the Institute till 2017. And since then launched the Yaron book show, January 2015, the day Charlie Hebdo was attacked. That same day I went live. I was going to do a practice session and decided to make it live given what had just happened. And since then, the Yaron book show has gone through many evolutions and is going to go through many more, I predict, in the next few months and years. But since then, I've been doing that. Over the years, I've become a public speaker and speak all over the world. And that's certainly part of the brand.
Yeah, and we got a lot of questions from people about, your work as a public intellectual and development as a speaker and commentator. I want to come to that in a little bit, but I'd like to hear more about, that had to be a big transition from kind of running some speaking companies and teaching as a professor of finance to now you're running the Ayn Rand Institute. What prepared you for that job, what did you do coming in and thinking, oh, I'm not prepared to figure out how to run it?
I think what prepared me was an understanding and a knowledge of a lot of the people involved. So because I'd run a conference business, I had employed Leonard Peikoff and had to deal with him as a employee, somebody who spoke for me. Harry, Peter, a lot of the people on the board, I'd interacted with them. I also knew a lot of the young up and coming intellectuals, Onkar being, obvious example. So I knew a lot of the talent that was available within Objectivism because we were students together at the Objectivist Graduate Center during the 1990s. I think also certain maturity around Objectivism. I'd been, so I took over at the Institute in 2000, January 2000. I'd been studying Objectivism by that point, for 23 years. I don't know how, some of those years weren't as effective as they could have, as maybe today with the Ayn Rand University and so on. But I'd been studying by myself and with others and in different formats and with the Ayn Rand Institute in all kinds of ways for 23 years. So I thought I came in with a certain knowledge of Objectivism. I also think I came in, pretty grounded. A lot of objectivists, and Leonard Peikoff talks about this in Understanding Objectivism, and we've talked about this many times at the Institute. So, rationalism is a big problem in the objectivist movement, and a certain detachment from reality or from what it actually means in terms of actually living it. And I think I came in with a relatively healthy relationship with Objectivism, if you can put it in those terms. In terms of it being part of my life. I mean, aspects of it, I probably still hold a little rationalistically, but I think relative to many other people, I think I was pretty grounded back then and even more so today. So that was all the pluses. A lot of the uncertainty about coming into the role is, well, what do you do with the Ayn Rand Institute? Okay, so you've got, I remember I used to commute down because I started at the Institute part-time because I still had commitments as a professor, and I would scribble all kinds of ideas for strategy and all kinds of ideas for what I wanted, what I thought would be good and what made sense and what didn't make sense. And it was hard, and it's still hard. I mean, I know Tal still scribbles, right? And what do you do? Okay, so I'm running something called the Ayn Rand Institute, but what does that mean? What is the goal? I know what the mission is, but how do you implement that mission? And the other thing to remember is at the time in 2000, the Institute budget was about a sixth or seventh of what it is today. The number of employees was, I can't remember, it was maybe 10, 12. And there were no other intellectuals on staff. So there were no professional intellectuals on staff. One of my first hires was Onkar, because I understood, for me, right from the beginning, what we needed were intellectuals. What we needed was both to produce intellectual content and to continue to train intellectuals, and to do it more systematically. And that was one of the first missions I think Onkar took on, was to develop such a systematic program of training future intellectuals. So what do you do with it? What should be the strategy was, I think, the thing that I found most difficult. And I remember there were days where I didn't quite know what to do. You got a full-time job and you're sitting at the desk, and I wasn't sure what I should do. It's very, you have to motivate yourself and you have to drive yourself. I didn't have a boss. I had a board of directors that basically ultimately was looking to me for answers. And it was hard to figure out what to do, right? I think a lot got clarified pretty quickly, but there were days where it was very strange in the sense that, what do you do? What do you do as a professional intellectual or what do you do as the CEO of an intellectual organization? Not at all clear. Not at all clear. I see Tal is smiling. Maybe nothing's changed in the last 20-something years.
Before I accepted the job, it is the hardest thing. And we're talking about why we pay CEOs a little bit more, because of the challenge of strategically guiding the organization. That's a really hard task.
Yeah, I mean, that's the primary job of a CEO, is to strategically guide the organization, and then put in all the factors, the resources, the human and capital resources, to make that strategy a reality. But those are the challenges.
Yeah, I remember as a teenager getting my copy of Impact Monthly and say, ARI hires new intellectual to create program. It was the first time I had heard of Onkar. And that was, I think that was the first copy of Impact I ever got too. So I'm curious how you've thought about your enjoyment of work. Like, have you always enjoyed what you're doing? And if not, like, how have you tried to move towards greater enjoyment? Like, how do you make sure, because it's one thing, and we could explore more about making an institution like ARI successful, but I think for this class, one interesting thing is, how do you move more and more towards a vision of like, yeah, I'm really enjoying what I'm doing, and making that a primary consideration?
Yeah, I mean, it really is a path of self-discovery. I don't think it's obvious what you're going to enjoy and what you're not going to enjoy. I never thought of myself as a teacher before I started teaching, and even when I first started teaching, I didn't really enjoy it. I gained a real appreciation for it and gained enjoyment of it over time. And I, in every aspect of the job at ARI, and then later, you have to figure out what you like and what you don't like. So it became pretty obvious to me that what I liked was the strategic thinking, the kind of the deploying the resources, the putting the pieces together, and what I liked was the intellectual work. Some of my, the best time I had was the interactions with Onkar, and just learning and talking and figuring stuff out. That was super fun. And I also discovered what I don't like, and it became pretty obvious that what I didn't like was the day-to-day process of managing people. I don't get people. No, but it was challenging, even in a objectivist organization. It's not easy, and I didn't particularly enjoy it. I had many conversations with people like John Allison and others on how to do it better and how to improve on it. And I think I got better, but I don't think I ever mastered it completely. But that was to me the most challenging. And I'd say when I left the Institute, the biggest relief I had was, God, I don't have to manage people anymore. It was a huge load off. And in a sense, I did get to do the stuff I really enjoyed. And even during the Institute, at some point I hired a chief operating officer. to a large extent in order to allow me to focus on the things I thought I did well and enjoyed. There are aspects of fundraising I enjoy. There are aspects of fundraising I hate. But that's something I had to do. So I knew I had to focus on that. I loved public speaking and the intellectual work. So having a chief operating officer who handled kind of the day-to-day management helped do that. So yeah, I mean, once you know what you like and don't, and it's not obvious, right? You have to live it to some extent. Some things you know, but some things you have to live in order to figure out what you like and don't like. I didn't know I was a public speaker until I became a public speaker. I didn't know I was good at it until I became good at it. And it's not, I had some intrinsic knowledge of, or intrinsic passion to get up on stage and do stuff. That's not me at all. It was again, a process of discovering how to do it and that I enjoyed it. It was obvious to me that I enjoyed teaching once I got into it. So it's a process of discovery. And then in your career, to the extent that you have control over it, trying to get better at the things you're not good at, because it's important, and at the things you might not enjoy, the better you'll get at them, the more you'll enjoy them. And then trying to figure out how to structure your life in a way that you can minimize the things that you don't enjoy to the extent that that's possible. I mean, fundraising clearly was something I had to do. Managing people is something clearly I had to do. So there was no way to just shrug that off. You had to, you do it, you get the best resources you can to make it easier, but you still have to do it until you get to the point in your career where you cannot do it.
Well, maybe you could say, so you mentioned fundraising a couple times. We were talking about negotiation and how, like, a lot of times people feel uncomfortable for asking for, what they think they're worth. I certainly struggled with that. My memory, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that at least in the early days, your fundraising team was constantly saying, Yaron, you got to go for the ask. And you weren't, and that's certainly something you've gotten better at. So maybe you can say a little bit about how you've approached building that muscle.
Yeah, no, making the ask is very hard, particularly, I mean, some people are more tuned to kind of a sales mentality where you ask. I was not. I'd never been in sales. I didn't know how to do it. It didn't come natural to me at all. But when you interact with people who have a lot of money and you're trying to raise money, it becomes pretty clear after a while that they want you to make the ask. That they're disappointed in a sense when you don't. They might say no, but what are we doing here if you're not making the ask? What is this, all this conversation? What is all this? What do you want from me? Right? Put it out. And some of them will say that, very few, but some of them will say that. But a lot of them are disappointed if you don't get to the point. And the point is, I'd like X dollars, or I'd like your support. And so realizing that helped. The second thing is that it helps when you believe in the product and you love the product and you're passionate about the product. And that's true of yourself if you're asking for a raise, but it's also true of a business when you're raising capital, or of a nonprofit if you're out there asking for support. Once I got into what the value proposition was, it was easy to then say, and this is what we need in order to make it work. This is what I'm asking you for. So it's, and the other thing you realize is people want to support specific things. They want to own them. They want an ownership piece. So, at some point we figured out that, I don't know, giving people certain schools for the book project, they loved the idea that they were providing books to students for the high school that they went to, or the county that they lived in, or the state that they were residing in, or something like that. So, and then of course, the most important thing I think is hooking into their own self-interest. Why is this good for them, right? Why is this the thing that they should do with their money? There's lots of stuff they could do with the money. So once you get comfortable with this, it's in the self-interest, it's important, they want you to ask, then it's relatively easy to ask. And at some point you get, I could get a little obnoxious about it, but some people deserve it, right? So I had a guy, Tal knows who this is. I had a guy who would always tell me he's going to give me a lot of money. And I'd go back and I'd never, the check would not arrive and I have to bug him and bug him. Finally, maybe he'd send a check in. And so once I was in his office and he said, I'm going to give you guys $100,000. And I said, that's great. Can you write me a check now? And he said, I'll send it to you. I said, no, I'm not leaving the office until you write me the check. I literally said that. And because I knew, I'd have to bug him for months to get the money. It's not that he was lying. It was this is his personality. So he went to his desk, pulled out a checkbook and wrote a check for $100,000 and handed it to me. So, sometimes you've got to do it. But I was at that point, I knew the guy. We had a friendly relationship. I could say that with a smile, not with like a frown or I'd say, in the past, it's taken me a lot to get that. I'm not leaving. So you've got to be able to do it in a friendly way. And you got to know when to do it. Some other people would be offended and you couldn't get away with it. So you've got to know who you're dealing with. I think these are principles of sales. You got to know who you're dealing with. You got to know what your boundaries are, and you got to know what kind of relationship you have with them and how far you can push it. So, yes, again, a lot of the learning is, this is true of everything in life, right? You've got to go out and do it, and you got to repeat, but just repetition is useless. You've got to learn from every repetition. That is, every time you do something, you've got to go back, and this is true of public speaking, this is true of writing, this is true of everything. First of all, you've got to do it. If you don't do it, you'll never learn, you'll never get good at it. You've got to do it. And then, but you've got to constantly self-monitor. You've got to constantly monitor yourself. How did I do it? Did I do well? What did I do badly? What was this facial reaction when I said X versus Y? How can I get better at it? How can I do this more effectively? And that's how you get better at anything, I think. And it's iteration like that, where you're constantly learning from your experiences.
Well, speaking of that, I want to turn to your kind of development as a public intellectual. And in particular, I want to start with speaking. I've, to whatever extent I'm a good speaker, most of that came from things I learned from you. But you didn't start out as an electrifying speaker. And as I remember it, it was really around the financial crisis where you really started to click for you. And part of what I admired is that you didn't start out great. So I could really identify with, wow, look how good Yaron is, but he didn't begin that way. Maybe I could do something like that. How do you see sort of your trajectory, and what were the turning points for you in developing that skill?
Yeah, no, I certainly did not start out as an electrifying speaker. In my first class that I ever taught, I was an MBA student and I was asked to teach the finance class. For undergraduates that I just finished. So it was a semester after I'd learned the material, I was teaching it at the University of Texas in Austin. And I think Tal my wife came to one of the classes, and she was like, this is hopeless. This is not your career. It was not good. Partially because I didn't know the material that I was teaching. And that's never good, right? I was learning it while I was teaching it. I was figuring it out while I was teaching it. But then once I got into the classroom at Santa Clara, I got much, much better. I improved constantly. And as I got better, I started enjoying it. And the improvement really came from gaining comfort with the material and then focusing on the students. Because why are you teaching? You're not teaching in order to just regurgitate the material in your head on the board or just to appear big and strong on stage. You're teaching to connect and to have an impact on people's lives and have an impact on people's knowledge, in the case here in finance. And once you start caring about the student in front of you, that's when it becomes interesting and fun and exciting. Once you are starting to monitor their response and trying to constantly improve so that they get it better. So I was a good teacher. I knew I was a good teacher coming into the job at ARI. But, being an intellectual at ARI was very daunting and very, it's scary. It's scary. I think it's less scary today, but it was really scary when Onkar and I think started, because the models were Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff. And that was it. And Leonard Peikoff was there, right? But it wasn't just the fact that they were there. It's the fact that they set such a high bar in a particular type of bar, and they delivered their content in a particular kind of way, in a particular kind of style. And then everybody delivered it in the same way, in the same style, basically. So everybody did. So lectures at Onkars, in the, what was called the Thomas Jefferson School, and then Lyceum, and early on in Onkar, everybody read their talks. Everything was, all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. And, every one of those talks could have been almost an essay coming out of the gate. And Leonard Peikoff was a master at both reading the talk and making it seem like it was extemporaneous, but almost nobody else is that good at it. And we used to get complaints. I remember when running conferences, why does everybody read their talks? This is not how you do public speaking. So when I started out at ARI, I would read my talks, and I think I was fairly good at it. I wasn't terrible, but I wasn't, it wasn't Leonard Peikoff level, but I was okay at it, at reading the talks and giving some emotion into it and getting into it and so on. But it was very, very intense and intimidating. The amount of editing that went into the talks, limited how many talks you could give. Once you developed the talk, you wanted to give it as many times as you could, because you'd put so much effort into the writing of the talk. And it wasn't like teaching. It wasn't as fun. You're standing up on stage, and it's not as much fun, because you're tied to the notes, and you're not really seeing what's going on in the audience, and you're not really observing them. And so you don't get that connection. You don't get that sense of impact that you're having on an audience. And so sometime around the financial crisis, I was working on talks on capitalism. Previous to that, I'd pretty much given all my talks on foreign policy. Oh, and the other part of it is that the most fun in a talk was the Q&A. And I thought I was really good at Q&As. And the Q&As were completely extemporaneous. You can't prep for a Q&A. And yet I was pretty good at it, and people were more connected, and there was more involvement by the audience in the Q&A. And yet, we would write these talks that would go at least an hour long, sometimes over an hour, and you couldn't cut any word, because the words were, this is the only formulation that was possible. And yet where you really got the audience engaged and involved and passionate and excited was in the Q&A. And where I felt like I was really having fun was in the Q&A. So part of that, I came slowly to the realization that something was wrong here. That we needed to change the way we presented material, that it wasn't as effective as it could be. And so I was already thinking along those lines. And then we hired a couple of speaking coaches, and one in particular. I was in New York, where his office was, and we went. It was in he has a studio there, where he taped stuff, and he went through this exercise of, why do you give talks? What are you trying to achieve? What do you think people get from your talks? What do you think people leave with them? And then we did a little exercise where I read one of my talks, and we had somebody kind of off the street then tell me back what he'd heard. And it was shocking how little people absorb when you read a talk. And so basically it was obvious from what he said that I needed to go back to kind of the teaching style, a style where the talk is well prepared. It doesn't mean you're not preparing. It doesn't mean you're not writing it out. It doesn't mean you're not outlining it, but you're not reading it when you deliver it. You deliver it, and went through a number of phases where had some outlines, and then had very, on a podium, then had very short outlines on the floor. And then at some point you should be able to do it. You should know a talk to the point where you don't have to have any outline. Once I started doing that, it was obvious that it was right. And it was obvious that I was good at it. And part of it is that I loved it. I enjoyed it, right? Because you're interacting with the audience. The focus now is not on you inside your head. It's not your diction and how you pronounce the particular words. I remember the biggest problems we'd have with me reading talks is there's certain words I can't pronounce. I don't know why, but I just can't pronounce them. Yeah, some of you know this from the Yaron book show, the names and the words that I just people correct me all the time, doesn't matter. And they would be right there in black and white on the page, and I'd still mispronounce them. And we'd have to work on that. And all that worry about what's on the page disappears. You're now with the audience, you're focused on them, you're focused on what you want to present, on the 3 points that you have. And if you want more information on this, then come to my then sign up for the class that I'm teaching this summer for ARU on public speaking. And it's much more natural, it's much more fun. And I think it's much, much more efficient in terms of getting the points you want to get across to the people you want to get it across to. So again, it becomes more student focused rather than in your head focused.
What does it mean to be a generalist? Because I think some people think being a generalist just means, well, I just say whatever I want whenever, the opportunity arises, and that there's not a unique kind of skill set involved in it.
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of questions there. One is, why specialize? I think because the scope of human knowledge is so extensive that if you're going to have an impact in your field, you need to have a field. You need to have deep knowledge in that particular area, integrated into a lot of other areas. I mean, Alex specializes energy, but he knows a lot about business, and he knows obviously a lot about philosophy, and he knows a lot about other things. But he is a specialist. He's specialized and then integrated with everything else, that speciality, and that's, I think, how you need to approach it. And again, the reason is the complexity of reality of the world, and the fact that there is so much knowledge out there. There's so much to learn about any particular field, and that if you're going to be convincing, and if you're going to make an argument about a particular field, you better know it. And knowing it is not trivial. And it's, I used to have friends who thought, when I was young, that if you knew philosophy, you knew everything, because philosophy explains everything, right? It's a fundamental set of ideas that explains everything. So if you know philosophy, everything else is the deduction from philosophy. So how complicated could it be to know everything you need to know about energy? In a sense, we know everything we need to know about energy. All you need to know about energy is we should be free. That's it. Now go and make an argument like that about energy. I mean, you can't. It completely goes over people's heads. They don't get it. They don't understand it. But what about this? And what about that concrete? And what about this connection? And what about externalities? And what about a million different things, right? And you better have answers. And you're not going to have answers as a generalist for the most part to those kind of things. So one is, I think you need to specialize because the nature of reality requires it. It requires specialization. It requires deep knowledge in particular areas as an intellectual where you want to have an impact. How to choose a specialization is complicated. I mean, it depends on your values. You have to figure it out. Yeah. Again, there's no replacement to trying different things out, right? Alex was doing all kinds of things, and he was reading all kinds of different material and trying to figure out what the hell Yaron wanted and what he should specialize in. And then he fell in love with energy. He fell in love because of an essay he wrote on Rockefeller. He fell in love, and he suddenly realized, whoa, this is really, really important. And huge, and it's a big area, and it's not narrow, and there's a lot to learn. He suddenly realized. So read a bunch of stuff, right, and figure out what you really find interesting. What do you really find interesting right now? I mean, I could tell you what I find interesting. If I was going to specialize now, what I would specialize in, but that's not going to help you. I mean, we don't have an expert today. You want to know what I specialize right now? Artificial intelligence. There should be an objectivist out there that defends that is, one of the biggest issues right now is in business and is, the guy who's responsible for the biggest advance in AI in recent times, Sam Altman, goes in front of Congress and says, please regulate us because we're really, really dangerous. Like, what is our response? And what do we know about how to structure that response? And what do we know about AI? And what do we know about the dangers or the lack of dangers? And how do we defend that? And I talk about it, but I know when I'm talking about it, I don't know enough to do a real deep dive and really talk about it. So technology generally, I think is fascinating. I did a show on chips, on semiconductors, and the implications, the implications for foreign policy, the implications for domestic policy, the implications for a lot of different things that have philosophical roots. But that's just in policy economics. You don't have to specialize in areas like that. You can specialize in ethics if you're a philosopher. You can specialize in culture. You can specialize in free speech. You can specialize in, I don't know, sexuality. That's a big issue right now, right? Sexuality. So you can specialize in a million different things, but you have to find something that interests you, that you're passionate about, that you can see the integration with philosophy, and somebody says biotech and life extension, huge, right? Huge areas that require philosophy and a philosophical defense or philosophical perspective. You have to figure out what interests you. It might start out as a very narrow thing that expands broader. It might start out as something broad that goes narrow. There is no rule here. The reality is endlessly fascinating. There are endlessly interesting things out there. Start with something, specialize in it, see how far it'll take you, see if you can broaden it, and maybe switch specialization after 5 years. It's not like if you do one, you're set for life and you can't do anything else. So experiment and play around with it. Also, this whole idea of me telling you to specialize, this idea of people specializing, no, the idea of this is a new idea. This is not a new idea in the sense that it doesn't exist out there, but it maybe is a new idea in the sense of we're now thinking about this as a way to change the culture, as a way for intellectuals to do work. I don't know what the right calibration is. You guys have to go out and figure it out. And it's kind of funny me saying this because I'm, of course, the generalist. So I'm the one who hasn't specialized. Or specialized. I went from specialization to generalization because I'm specialized in finance and somewhat economics, and then generalized from that. But
that's what I was gonna, because I was a little surprised by your answer, Yaron, and that I would think, so I'll tell you my view, and you can respond to it, which is briefly. I think a generalist plays a real role, that they specialize in integration, and part of what they're helping you do is they're bringing together all of these different issues and parts of the economy and cultural issues, and helping you see the big picture, the direction of a country, the direction of a culture. That seems to be a real value, though I agree with you. The people who are really good at that often they usually have a few areas where they have very, very deep knowledge. And like you said, even yourself, there's a few areas that at a specialist level or close to it.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right, Don. But I also think those people are rare. They're not a lot of specialists, and they shouldn't be a lot of specialists. But yes, the value they contribute is the integration. But that's hard, and I don't know how. I don't know how to teach that. We've had the conversations about this. How do you teach that? But to see the patterns and the integrations and to see the connections is more difficult. So, I'm not. Yeah, I think that most intellectuals should specialize, and you always need a certain group of intellectuals who are generalists.
One way to think about it is being a generalist is a specialty.
Yeah.
And the kind of, I think part of what you're trying to combat, Yaron, is a generalist who thinks of it as easy because it's, I'm interested in a whole bunch of different things, so I'll talk about a whole bunch of different things. But if you're thinking of it from the perspective, am I providing value to anybody versus doing things that I just happen to like doing and talking about, it's hard to provide value as a generalist, but it's also as a specialist. But part of it is to know something at a level of depth that you provide value to other people. And that's the kind of higher level that one should be thinking about, is what I'm doing providing value to people. And it takes a lot of work to get to the point that you provide value as a specialist or a generalist.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard, and it's also, it's very tempting, and there's so many people out there who do this, to view being a generalist as commenting on everything and having something to say about everything. You know, the biggest temptation I have, particularly doing a daily show, is to want to have an opinion about everything. And one of the biggest challenges is to be able to step back and say, I don't know what the hell is going on. You know, or I know a little bit, but I don't know enough. And that's really hard. I mean, and by the time I usually gain enough information to say something about a hot story in the news, the story's passed and nobody's interested anymore, because everybody in the news cycle we live in, everybody just wants that immediate reaction, immediate outraged response, and collecting facts and thinking about something is not very sexy.
How do you deal with criticism, negative feedback on your talks, on your, radio show? You get more of it probably than any objectivist. Maybe Alex can give you a run for your money, but definitely you get a lot of it. How do you take that? And maybe you want to separate out kind of just anonymous people online versus people you respect who say, Yaron, I think that was a bad performance, or you got that wrong.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you have to separate those out. I mean, people I respect, I actually value that kind of negative feedback, and usually they're right, and usually there's something I could do better. And the only way to learn is by taking that kind of advice seriously and using it. I mean, the number of times I was told by Linda Peikoff that I don't know what I'm doing is pretty astounding. But I learned from that, and it was incredibly valuable every time it happened. And the number of times Onkar's told me, no, that's wrong, you should think about it differently. But how are you going to learn? It's hard to do everything yourself. And it's harder than judge yourself and self-monitor yourself. So I'm sure, so what you have to develop is, and I don't know what this takes, but it's a certain self-esteem. It certainly is related to self-esteem. You have to be willing to accept the fact that you're going to say stuff that's wrong. I mean, you don't want to embrace that. You don't want to accept, you don't want to go out of your way to say anything wrong. But you've got to accept the fact that you're going to be wrong. Just like the advice you give entrepreneurs is you're going to fail. You're just not everything you do is going to work out. And you're going to learn from those failures. You're going to get up on your feet and you're going to go at it again. And that's basic 101 advice we give entrepreneurs. Failures is part of the process. Well, being wrong is part of the process of being intellectual. Maybe not for Ayn Rand, but for mere mortals like us, I definitely think that. And you have to accept that. And then the challenge is, how many times can you recognize for yourself when you're wrong? And then the incredible value that other people provide you when they tell you you're wrong, right? Other people are giving you a massive value when they tell you you're wrong, and if they're right about it, right? And that's generally my attitude towards criticism. I mean, it doesn't always work like this because emotions sometimes intervene, but basically, if somebody gives you criticism and they're right, then you should say thank you. And if somebody gives you criticism and they're wrong, then who cares? It's kind of their problem, not yours, right? So that's it. So, sometimes it's not easy to put into practice, but that's the basic attitude. And I think you develop the kind of self-esteem where you can live up to that and live that way. I think that's true in all aspects of life. And it's certainly true for intellectuals. One of the things I miss about not being at the Institute, one of the challenges, I think, of a work-at-home environment, and certainly for me, not being day-to-day connected to the Institute, is not getting the negative feedback, or not getting, wouldn't even call it negative, but just the feedback of, wait a minute, here's a different way of, you're not thinking about this right. Think about this or think about that. That is incredibly valuable. And one of the things that I think Onkar and I talked about for many years about wanting to create within Objectivism is the kind of intellectual environment, the kind of intellectual community. I know that for some people that's a bad word, but an intellectual community where people can actually say to one another, hey, what you said in the talk, it's not exactly right. You might want to think about it this way or that way, or even, that talk was shit. It was just bad. And that people respect that, and people accept that, and people move on and grow and learn from it. And that I really hope that one day that's the kind of intellectual community we have in objectivism, and where people can accept that and live with that and grow and learn from that. Right?
Onkar, you made the point several times during our classes where there, and even today, where there's the kind of religious mentality at work where it's in effect like I'm trying to in effect gain a deity's approval rather than I have a would you say like this is an example of it where people in effect, as long as like if I want to avoid saying something wrong, and like they're less concerned with going out there and achieving something positive, and so there's the kind of the sin is not to fail to promote my ideas, it's to like reveal that I'm capable of making mistakes or capable of errors. There seems to be some overlap with what Yaron's highlighting and the kind of points that you've been drawing out about an attitude to values.
Yes, there is a connection. I think that it's anytime you're emphasizing the avoidance of a negative over the achievement of a positive, something's wrong, and like seriously wrong with the whole attitude / orientation. So anytime it's, if I fail, that's the big issue. If I give it a good time, okay, yeah. But if it gets something wrong, or there's just the whole motivation and goal directedness there's something askew, and one has to think a lot about. But I would say there are reasons to be intimidated here. And Yaron said the ARI, and particularly when you joined ARI, there was an aspect that was intimidating. It's that you want to live up to the philosophy, that the philosophy has all kinds of profound new truths. The mission of the Institute is to get those out. And if you don't do it right, then you're betraying the mission of the Institute. And so there is a real issue there that's not a religious issue. But you're part of what Yaron said in this context, but he was generalizing it, and we've made that point often. You can't improve unless you do things. So you can, and we've given sports analogies at sometimes, and I've said it's useful to think about sports because there's a lot of things one can learn, and it's a distilled kind of environment in which one can learn things. And that's like, it can't be that Michael Jordan can somehow get to his level and not actually play games all the time. That, like his future self as an NBA star would crush himself at high school, but he's got to play the high school games and he's got to develop. And that, like, you have to have that perspective, and that has to be the primary perspective. Otherwise, you're not focused on values and what actual value achievement requires.
Yaron, for those who objectivists who maybe aren't pursuing an intellectual career, do you have any kind of big picture thoughts on what they could be doing to better leverage the philosophy or the objectivist community?
Well, I mean, I think that there are a couple of buckets there. One is, support the people who are, I'm always a fundraiser, support the people who are doing the work and producing the intellectual content. And the second is, I find objectivists really fearful about sharing content. Like, we live in this area of social media, we live in this era of the internet, where you can actually have a huge impact by taking Ayn Rand's content or ARI content or whatever content and using social media to share it and kind of let the world know about it and maybe comment on it, but put it out there. And I find so much resistance, partially because, well, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting psychological question about why that is. But part of it is that everybody wants to be, I think part of it is that people want to be original. They want the content to be theirs, and they find it unsatisfying to share other people's content. And I think that there's a real profound mistake there, particularly given that we're all learning this philosophy from Ayn Rand. I think it really undermines it. If you think about all the other movements out there, the grassroots is so eager and so good at sharing the content that their intellectuals produce and using that content and maybe commenting on it, but there's always a link to an article, a video, or something. And I find it interesting that the objectivist movement is really in a defensive mode. It's like, we're afraid to offend, maybe personally because of personal relationships, or we just don't feel enough self-confidence in presenting the material because we might be asked to defend it and we're not sure we can. I don't know, but getting the word out there, being much more confident about your own views and being willing to stand by them and willing to stand by the people articulating those views in public, I think is something that could be really, really helpful for everybody to engage in.
All right, we have a couple minutes left. Here's again, this is from Stefan. After all these interviews, what is one question you wish somebody had asked you, but nobody has yet?
That's exactly the kind of questions I blank out completely on. I have no idea. I wish some of the interviewers would, many of them have read the philosophy and read Ayn Rand. I wish there were a few that understood it. That the criticism came from a point of understanding, at least, and not agreeing, but understanding. It's in a sense boring to hear the same. What if there was a hot girl at the bar? Why wouldn't it be selfish to go sleep with every hot girl in the bar? It's like, come on, Ayn Rand didn't hold that. Isn't that obvious from every scene in Atlas Shrugged that she didn't hold that as the view of selfishness? So what is it that you're missing? Why can't you introspect and figure out why you don't get it, right? Rather than asking the same silly question over and over again? I wish there was more demand. It would make my life easier. I still feel like I'm pushing, and it's not pull. Like, I'm not being pulled by the demand. Now it could be like, I'd make a lot more money if I was pro-Trump, right? A lot more money. I mean, it would not even the ballpark. Or there are a few other issues where I could easily, as Ayn Rand was offered $1 million to integrate God into it. There's so many little things like that you could do that. But I'm still not at the point, and I don't know that I ever will be at the point where there's real demand, right? People are still, even the groups out there that have me speak, it's always with hesitancy. It's still difficult as popular as maybe I am within the objectivist world, or even, I'm not even sure if that's true, but, within a particular subgroup within the objectivist world, I'm not anywhere else really. And even the people who I think like me when I present, I don't get a lot of invitations. It's a very strange world out there. The relationship of other intellectuals in the world to me is very weird. The relationship between student groups, they respect me, they like me, they think I'm a great speaker, but they're not inviting me to come and speak, because they're not sure about the message and they're not sure what they're embracing when they have me come in. Objectivism is still, I think, really still a challenge for everybody out there, and still something people have, even now friends supposedly have a kind of a love-hate relationship with.